Hello everyone! Today I decided to make a video on the Bechdel test and use it on the Walt Disney Animation Studios films. I always wanted to see whether these films passed the test or why they didn't, and go into how much they passed, how much they failed, or if they were close to passing or failing. So, overall, the Bechdel test is a measure of the representation of women in film and by extension in fiction in general. But I'm specifically focusing on film, and that's the tool that's mostly used on. The test asks whether a film features at least two women talking to each other about anything other than a man. The measure sometimes is enhanced by adding two female characters that have names in the movie. Passing or failing this test isn't necessarily indicative of how well women are represented in any specific work, since there's many levels to it. In general, the test is used as an indicator for the active presence of women in the entire field of film and other fiction, and to call attention to gender inequality in fiction, and to also show that women aren't just relegated to love or being love interests. In general, there are three criteria when it comes to the Bechdel test. So, the movie has to have at least two women in it. Some criteria has this as them being named and others don't. The second one is the women have to talk to one another. And the third is they have to talk about something other than a man. So we're going to go through each of the films, except for some of the package films, to determine whether they pass or fail based off this criteria. Since we're going by chronological order, I have to talk about Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs first. So, it does pass the Bechdel test, though it's kind of barely passes. So, it does have two female characters in Snow White and the Queen. They do talk to one another in the third act, though the Queen is disguised, but she's disguised as an older woman, and they do talk about things other than the man. They talk about Snow White's cooking, they talk about wishing, they talk about dreams, and they talk about the older woman's supposed illness. But you can tell there's an undertone that kind of turns it around back to a man, so that's why I say it barely passes, because while they do talk about things other than a man, it's always kind of in one of the layers of the situation in their conversation. So Pinocchio absolutely fails the Bechdel test, as there aren't two female characters in the movie, as the only notable one is the fairy. There's no other woman for the fairy to talk to, and of course, since there's no other woman to talk to, of course there's no conversation with another woman about anything other than a man. For Dumbo, I am putting it as a fail in this category. While there are the female elephants, none of them are really characters. They don't really have names, and they're all kind of seen as one character, if that makes sense, since none of them are their own defined characters, and because of this, they are not seen as their own separate characters who talk to one another about anything other than a man. It's just the elephants. You know what I mean? So I don't really count that. And they don't really have names either, so moving on. Bambi does fail the Bechdel test, though it doesn't fail as much as Dumbo does. So there are two female characters in the movie, with Feline and Bambi's mom, but they never talk to one another, and because they never talk to one another, they don't have a chance to talk to one another about anything other than a man. Cinderella easily passes the Bechdel test. There are many female characters in Cinderella, Lady Tremaine, Drizella, and Anastasia. There are several conversations where the four women are talking to one another, and there are many conversations where they aren't talking about anything other than a man. You see this with Cinderella's interactions with her stepsisters and stepmother, though there are a few conversations with Lady Tremaine and her children that are about getting a man. But it isn't about a man in specific, and there are many other conversations between the women in the film that don't involve a man, so it easily passes. Alice in Wonderland easily passes the Bechdel test. There are two defined characters in Alice and the Queen. They do talk to each other a lot during the one scene that we do see the Queen, and none of their conversations involves a man whatsoever. Pretty simple, very self-explanatory. There's nothing much to discuss in this element, so we're just going to move right along. Peter Pan does pass the Bechdel test, though it was pretty close to failing, and I'll explain it in more detail. There are two female characters in the movie. There are more than two female characters in the movie, but half of them in Tinkerbell and Tiger Lily don't talk. So the only ones that do talk are Wendy and Mrs. Darling. Of course, the mother and daughter do talk to one another throughout the movie, and they do talk about things other than a man, as Wendy and Mrs. Daring talk about the latter's outfit while she and her husband are trying to go out, and they do have other smaller conversations as well, though it is overshadowed by Mr. Darling speaking to Wendy. Lady and the Tramp sadly does fail the Bechdel test, though it was pretty close to passing. There are more than two female characters in the movie, as there's Aunt Sarah, there is Lady, and Darling is the only other female character. There is also the Peggy Lee dog in the movie. So they do talk to one another, mainly the two dogs, and I'm not too sure if Aunt Sarah and Darling speak to one another. But it ends up failing the Bechdel test because Peggy Lee Dog and Lady are talking about Tramp, and that's the only main focus of their conversation. So it was close to passing, but it just didn't make that mark. Sleeping Beauty does pass the Bechdel test. There are more than two female characters in the movie, since there's Queen Leah, there's Aurora, there's Maleficent, there's Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather. A bunch of them do speak to one another. Even Maleficent and Queen Leela has a small exchange. And of course, Aurora and the three fairies speak to one another quite a lot. And they talk about many other things that don't involve a man. So, most of the conversations with the three fairies aren't involving a man, and even the conversations with Aurora isn't about a man for the most part, as they do kind of just banter off one another. It is interesting that the three classic films that always get so much flack for their female representation easily pass the Bechdel test for all of them. 101 Dalmatians is the next movie, and it does pass the Bechdel test. So there are two female characters in Perdita, Anita, and Cruella de Vil, and obviously Perdita cannot speak to the two others since she's a dog and they are human. But Anita and Cruella do speak to one another, and the context of the conversation isn't about a man. They are also classmates, if I remember correctly, so they do have history with one another. The Sword and the Stone easily fails this. The only notable female in the movie is Madame Mim, and she's only in the last act where she appears in one scene. She doesn't have any other women to talk to in the movie, since her main conversation is with Merlin, and due to that, she doesn't have the opportunity to talk to another woman about anything other than a man. The Jungle Book also easily fails the Bechdel test, as there aren't two female characters in the movie. I think the only notable one is Shanti, who appears in the last scene of the movie. With this in mind, she doesn't have a chance to talk to another woman in the movie, and of course, she doesn't have the chance to talk to another woman about anything other than a man. Actually, there is Mowgli's mother, the wolf mother, but I don't even think she speaks in the movie, and she's only in one scene in the very first act. The Aristocats is one of the movies that easily passes the Bechdel test. There are more than two female characters in the movie, as there is Madame, I'm not even going to try to pronounce her name, but the elderly human owner. And then there's Marie and Duchess. Marie and Duchess have a lot of conversations with one another, so they do talk. And of course, since Marie is a child, their conversations don't really involve a man, as we see Duchess teaching Marie and guiding her in many other elements in the movie. So it's an innocent mother daughter relationship, which is nice to see since Disney really shows that. Robin Hood is a movie that passes in the Bechdel test, but it barely passed. So there are two main female characters in the movie, in Maid Marian and Lady Cluck, and since they are best friends, they do talk to one another quite a bit. I was thinking that a lot of their conversations involved Robin Hood, but their very first interaction with one another involved them playing tennis and just goofing around and having fun. So that very first conversation caused them to pass the Bechdel test. The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh fails it easily. I think the only main female character in the movie is Kanga, so she doesn't have another woman to talk to in the movie, and there's no other woman to talk about anything other than a man with. So, next. The Rescuers is a movie that passes the Bechdel test, as there are more than two female characters in Penny, Bianca, and Madame Medusa. Bianca and Penny talk to one another when they finally meet, and of course Medusa and Penny talk to one another, and none of the conversations involve a man, so of course it passes with flying colors. So the Fox and the Hound does fail the Bechdel test, but it could have passed if one category was fixed. There are more than two female characters in the movie, as there is Big Mama, there is Foxy, I think, her name is Trixie, whatever, the female fox that ends up falling in love with Todd, and there is Lady Tweed. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly. So, we do see Big Mama talk to Trixie, but the conversation is solely about Todd, so that's why it ends up failing the Bechdel test. So, the Black Cauldron does fail, and it fails quite easily, but not as easily as some other movies. There are two female characters in Elan Way and those fairy creatures, but the fairy creatures are seen as a character and they aren't really their own defined characters. So there is no really speaking to one another in the movie, and because of that, there's no talking about anything other than a man in the movie. The Great Mouse Detective fails quite easily. So there are two female characters in the movie, in Olivia and the Queen, but they have absolutely no chance to speak to one another, and obviously due to this, they can't talk about anything other than a man. Oliver and Company is another movie that fails the Bechdel test. There are two or more female characters in Penny, Georgette, and Rita, but none of them really talk to one another. Actually, I remember Penny saying something to Georgette, but it's not a conversation since only one person speaks something very quickly. And due to this, they don't have a chance to talk about anything other than a man. And the one example of Penny speaking to Georgette isn't a conversation if it's just one person saying something, and Georgette can't or is unable to communicate back. So, The Little Mermaid is another movie in this long row of films that fails the Bechdel test. There are two and more female characters with Ariel, Carlotta, Ursula, and her sisters. Ariel and Ursula do talk to one another, so there is that interaction there, but the entire discourse of the conversation is about a man, since that is what Ursula uses to try to sway Ariel over, and it's too big of a point of the conversation to ignore, so that's why it fails the Bechdel test. The Rescuers Down Under is the easiest fail of the Bechdel test so far. Bianca is the only female character in the film. She doesn't have a chance to talk to anyone, much less another woman, and due to that, she doesn't have the chance to talk to another woman about something other than a man, as she's solely treated as a love interest in this movie. So, Beauty and the Beast is the first movie in quite a while that passes the Bechdel test, though it barely passed in my opinion. There are two or more female characters in the movie, with Belle, of course, Mrs. Potts, the Bimbettes, and the closet woman. I don't remember her name, if she even has one. So some of them do talk to one another, and it is about something other than a man, though Belle's interactions with Mrs. Potts and the closet woman is very minimal. So that is why it barely passed the Bechdel test, but it still passed, so yeah. Aladdin is a very easy fail, and it's arguably the easiest fail on this entire list. The only female in the movie that is worthy of anything is Jasmine. Due to this, she cannot talk to another woman in the movie, and due to that, she cannot talk to another woman about something other than a man in the movie, since there's no opportunity there. The Lion King also fails in the Bechdel test. There are two or more female characters in Nala, Sarabi, Nala's mother, and one of the hyenas. The only scene that I could somewhat muster there being some sort of interaction is when Nala and Simba are being bathed by their mothers, but they're mainly speaking to their children, and in that conversation it's mainly about Simba, so I don't really see how this would pass the Bechdel test, so moving on. Pocahontas definitely passes the Bechdel test. There are two female characters in the movie, mainly Pocahontas and Nakoma. Also, there's Grandmother Willow as well. They do all talk to one another, as there are many conversations with Pocahontas and Nakoma and Pocahontas and Godmother Willow. And some of these conversations do involve things other than a man, especially with Pocahontas and Nakoma's interactions in the beginning and Pocahontas and Grandmother Willow's conversations throughout most of the movie. The Hunchback of Notre Dame is an easy fail on the Bechdel test, since Esmeralda is the only woman character in the movie. She cannot talk to another woman in the movie if there aren't any, and of course, this means that she cannot talk to another woman about anything other than a man. Very self-explanatory. Hercules is a fail in the Bechdel test, though it was close to passing. There are two or more female characters in the movie, as there's Hercules' mother, Alchemy. Hopefully I said that correctly. There is Hera, there are the Muses, and there is Megara. The Muses and Megara do talk to one another, or they sing to one another technically, but the entire conversation/song is about Megara's feelings about Hercules and whether she should admit her feelings for him or not. So it fails in that element, causing it to fail overall. Mulan is a movie that is known for feminism, and this is a prime example of the Bechdel test not being the end-all, be-all pertaining female representation, and I'm saying this because it fails the Bechdel test. There are two or more female characters in the movie, as there is Fa Li, Mulan's grandmother, and Mulan herself, and they do talk to one another, but the conversations that I remember of Mulan with her mother and her grandmother is in the very beginning of the movie, in Honor to Us All, and the entire purpose of that is to prep her to get married to a man. And even in the first act, when it's just the Fa family, Mulan is mainly interacting with her father about the stuff that don't involve a man. Tarzan fails the Bechdel test, for sure. There are two or more female characters in the movie, with Jane, Kala, and Turk, and there is some interaction with them, though it is very, 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 very brief. But I think the main interaction, especially with Turk and Kala, involved Tarzan, and there really isn't anything else that the three of them would talk about that doesn't involve Tarzan, so it's an easy fail here. We are moving on to the post-Renaissance era with Dinosaur, and it easily fails the Bechdel test. There are two female characters with the mother Lemur and Nira, but they don't speak to one another, And with them not speaking to one another, they don't speak about anything other than a man. The Emperor's New Groove does pass the Bechdel test. There are 2 or more female characters with Yzma, Chicha, and her daughter. And Yzma does talk to Chicha quite a bit, and of course Chicha talks about her daughter, and none of these conversations involve a man, so it passes with flying colors. So, regarding Atlantis the Lost Empire, it does fail the Bechdel test. There are 2 or more female characters with Kida, Audrey, Helga, and the older women, but none of them speak to one another in the movie from what I recall or from what I remember. And with them not speaking with one another, they don't speak about anything that isn't a man, so it fails. Lilo and Stitch most definitely passes the Bechdel test. Of course, there's Lilo and Nani, but there's also the leader alien woman in the movie as well. Lilo and Nani have many conversations with one another, since they're the only ones living in their house at the moment, and they're sisters. And of course, all of their conversations, or most of them, don't involve a man at all, since their situation is very peculiar, sensitive, and it's about holding together their dysfunctional family from being completely broken, so they have more important things to talk about. Treasure Planet most definitely fails the Bechdel test. There are 2 or more female characters in Sarah and Captain Amelia, but they never have the chance to speak with one another or meet in general throughout the movie, so there's really nothing else to discuss in this manner. Brother Bear is an easy fail. From what I remember, there's only 1 female character in the movie, and that's kind of like the spiritual woman. So with that, she can't talk to another woman, and she can't talk to another woman about anything other than a man. So, next. Home on the Range definitely passes the Bechdel test, as it should have. There are definitely 2 or more female characters in the movie with Maggie, Mrs. Calloway, and Grace, or I think her name's Grace, and they're all the main characters of the movie. And with them being the 3 main characters of the movie, they talk to one another a lot. And most of their conversations, if not all of them, don't involve a man, as they have a goal to save their farm, so they have more important things to talk about. And while they do get love interest, it's such a minor part of the movie where it's not going to deter them from passing the Bechdel test. Chicken Little fails the Bechdel test. There are 2 or more female characters with Foxy Roxy, I think that's her name, and Abby Mallard, but they don't speak to one another at all throughout the movie, so there's no other chance for them to pass, and there's no other women in the movie, so yeah. With Meet the Robinsons, it does fail the Bechdel test, as there are 2 or more female characters with the adoption lady who runs the center, and there's Franny and a few other female members of the Robinson family, but they never get a chance to speak to one another, so there's nothing else I can do with this movie pertaining to the Bechdel test. Bolt definitely does pass the Bechdel test. There are 2 or more female characters with Penny, her mother, and Mittens, and Penny and her mother definitely talk to one another a lot, and many of the conversations don't involve a man, or at least a human man, but they're mother and daughter, and Penny, I think her name's Penny, is a child, so their conversation shouldn't be about a man in a romantic sense at least. The Princess and the Frog most definitely passes. There are 2 or more female characters in Tiana, Eudora, Charlotte, Mama Odie, etc. There are many conversations with Tiana and her mother, Tiana and her friend, and Tiana and Mama Odie. While some of these conversations are definitely about a man, many of them are about Tiana needing to prioritize her life and to stop working so hard and to stop being so short-sighted. Tangled definitely passes the Bechdel test, as there are 2 or more female characters with Rapunzel and Mother Gothel. At least they're the only ones who speak, at least, and they definitely talk to one another a lot throughout the movie. While they do discuss Flynn, they have many conversations, especially in the beginning of the movie, that don't involve a man, so the movie passes. Winnie the Pooh fails for the same reason why the many adventures of Winnie the Pooh failed the Bechdel test. There's only one female character in Kanga, and she doesn't have the chance to speak to another woman throughout the movie, meaning that she doesn't have a chance to speak to another woman about anything that's not a man. So we're going to move right along. Wreck-It Ralph was a movie that I initially thought failed the Bechdel test, but after looking into it more, it passes, though it's a very weak pass. There are two or more female characters in Calhoun, Vanellope, and some of the other racers in Sugar Rush, and Vanellope does speak to the other races of Sugar Rush, and it doesn't involve a man, so the movie barely passes. But I forgot about this interaction initially, so it's not a very strong one. Frozen is the easiest pass pertaining the Bechdel test and the Disney canon. There are two or more female characters with Elsa, Anna, and her mother, from what I remember. Elsa and Anna talk to one another a lot throughout the movie, and a lot of their conversations are about their sisterhood and their lack of bond. And while they do speak about a man, that is not the only thing they discuss, so it passes. Big Hero 6 fails the Bechdel test. There are two or more female characters with Aunt Cass, who doesn't interact with any other women. There's Gogo Tomato and Honey Lemon, but the two really don't have the chance to speak to one another or anyone in general, as they're just weak side characters. So the movie fails the Bechdel test. Zootopia most definitely passes the Bechdel test, as there are two or more female characters with the Shakira giraffe, Judy, the sheep villain in the movie, and Judy's mother. Judy speaks a lot with the sheep villain whose name that I'm misremembering right now, and the conversations don't involve a man, so it definitely passes. Their conversations are about being small animals that people like to overlook and disrespect, so that's not a man-involved conversation. Moana passes the Bechdel test. There are two or more female characters with Moana, her mother, her grandmother, and the Earth God, if I'm saying that correctly. Moana talks to her mother and grandmother quite a bit, and the conversations don't involve a man, or at least in a romantic sense, so it passes. Ralph Breaks the Internet easily passes the Bechdel test, well, its predecessor weakly passed it. There are definitely two or more female characters with Calhoun, Vanellope, the racers in her Sugar Rush game, and the one character that's played by Gal Gadot, if I remember correctly. Vanellope interacts with the new internet woman a lot, and the conversations involve her dreams and stuff, and it's not talking about Ralph particularly or solely, so it passes. Frozen 2 definitely passes the Bechdel test, as there is Elsa and Anna, and we even learn a lot more about their mother, who actually speaks in the movie. Elsa's mother talks to their children, or her children. Elsa and Anna speak a lot more to one another, and with Kristoff being a non-factor in the movie, all of their conversations don't involve a man, so this is the easiest pass for sure so far. Raya and the Last Dragon pass with flying colors. The two main characters are women named Namari and Rhea, and they have many interactions throughout the movie, so they talk a lot, and their interactions don't involve a man at all. And even if I didn't count that, Namari speaks to her mom a lot throughout the movie, and their conversations don't involve a man. So this is a very female-centric movie, which is a good thing. Encanto's another movie that passes with flying colors, as there are many female characters with Isabella, Mirabel, Abuela, and a bunch of their other female family members. They have many conversations with one another throughout the movie, and while some of them do involve a man, especially regarding Isabella, most of the conversations don't involve a man at all, and it's just about their family dynamics. So yeah, it passes. And the final movie in discussion is Strange World, and it does pass the Bechdel test. So there's a long string of movies within the last several that Disney has made that passes it. There are two women characters in The Mom and the project leader. I don't really remember their names, though I just watched the movie. And I do remember them talking a lot in the first third of the movie, and it mainly had to do with flying. So they did converse, and their conversations had nothing to do with a man. So it's cool that despite there not being a huge focus on the women, they do have enough to pass the Bechdel test. So I didn't include most of the package films, and the only ones that I did include were the Winnie the Pooh ones, since it's really just the same characters. So after looking at everything, I went through 53 films in total, and the results are 26 films passed the Bechdel test and 27 films failed the Bechdel test. So it's literally right down the middle. It's interesting because some of these movies only have two prominent women characters, or at least the ones that passed, but there's enough material there to pass the Bechdel test. And it's interesting because a lot of the older ones ended up passing, and a lot of those ones get a lot of flack for how their women characters are treated. While some of the so-called more progressive movies of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s failed it. Now, regarding the movies that failed the movie, the ones that are in red didn't pass any of the three categories. The ones that are in orange passed one of the categories, and the ones in the yellow passed two of the categories and barely failed. So they were close to making it, but they were just missing that final element about talking about anything that didn't involve a man. So I'm probably going to do this for some of the other studios, and it'll be interesting to look into. Thank you all for joining me on this journey, and I'll be back with something soon.